Kia ora and hello, I'm Chester for Earth Sciences New Zealand. This is your seasonal climate outlook. We're looking ahead to August, September, and October, and I am joined by John Tunster, both of Earth Sciences New Zealand and the Met Service. And John, we are talking all about El Nino, and we're looking ahead to spring. So, El Nino's here. It's getting stronger. That's one of our big headlines. What do you have to say about this El Nino so far?
Well, it's we promised a lot. It promised a lot,
Yep.
and so far, we're still in its early stages, but it has not disappointed so far in terms of the actual event is cranking along very impressively. Now, the impact on New Zealand, I think, is still primarily down the line, but so far, the general idea is everything's going to track with this El Nino.
For sure, we're still getting into the pattern, right? It's a journey. It's not a
Yeah.
storm. It's not a one-time situation. It doesn't last for just days or months. This is for weeks. It lasts for months, upwards of a year. And the headlines, let's get to it real quick. El Nino continues to strengthen, and the impacts will continue to be felt gradually over the next few months. We're seeing those patterns change. Dryness remains a concern, of course, with wetness or wetter conditions expected for the south and west of New Zealand. And overall, it's a warm lean to the next few months. What do you make of the headlines, and can you expand on those just a little bit, John?
So basically, the idea is this El Nino event is quite some way away from its peak. The
Mm,
peak is, I would say, at least 3 months away. And the impacts on us are going to really start to make themselves felt over the coming months, especially deeper into spring.
yes.
And effectively, one thing that comes out from that is as we go into spring, more wind for much of the country, dryness for decent amounts of the country,
Hmm.
apart from the southwest of the South Island and the west of the South Island. This area is kind of the standout where we're talking an awful lot about dryness, but we should bear in mind that August to October is normally getting into a pretty wet time of year for that part of the country, and
Hmm.
we're expecting even more rain than we normally would in those areas as a result of the increase in westerly flows. But for everywhere else, it's at least a drier flavor or significantly drier flavor. Those westerlies that we're expecting to develop primarily later August and especially into September, those really dry things out in general in eastern areas and also for the North Island, which should see just a it's going to be closer to the high pressure systems, I
Hmm.
think,
Hmm.
which keeps it a bit drier. Now, every now and then there will be frontal systems that come through and affect the whole country. So we're not saying no rain. We're just saying that over the 3 months it should average out to a drier flavor in most of these areas.
Right. So for someone who lives in, say, Gisborne or Auckland or Hamilton or, Christchurch, let's just say for argument's sake, the normal amount of rain you get for the 3 month period is 200 millimeters. That's not the normal amount for any of those places, but let's say it was. We probably will
It's
get.
close.
Yeah,
You can see on the left,
yeah, for
Gisborne
Gisborne, it's
225. Not
225.
bad, not bad.
You could probably expect, anywhere between quarter to half that, maybe three quarters, but you're not going to get that full 200 in most of those places.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see that as we say, that doesn't mean no rain. That just means that when things average out, we see less of it.
Mm.
I'm sure there will be some really dynamic weather systems that come through. I would say, especially in sort of October time. And, there'll be widespread rain with those events, but for the 3 months, less than normal for an awful lot of the country, I think.
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed too as we were putting together this forecast that this 3 month period, it's still a pretty wet period for a lot of the country.
Mhm.
We still have a lot of winter left. Spring could be quite wet for some areas, especially early in the spring. So we're going to have wet periods. We're going to have those storm systems, as you mentioned. We just expect fewer of them, and that is why the rain totals won't add up to what you would normally see in the springtime.
Yeah, exactly. And I wouldn't be surprised to see some pretty decent southerlies coming on the back end of some mobile features, which will bring rain to eastern areas.
Hmm.
One thing to watch out for in those cases is, keep an eye on things like the thunderstorm outlook, because those dynamic spring setups can sometimes line up quite well for thunderstorms in eastern areas.
Oh, it's good to know. Yeah, that's a little. That could be a little let's say, spanner in the works, if you will, for some people. Like you may get a brief downpour in that easterly or something like that.
Exactly. It could well be very dry, some bunch of warm, dry northwesterlies in the east, followed by a southerly change, which, could dump a whole lot of hail or heavy rain.
Sure.
Tricky to deal with if you're a grower.
And we're actually in the midst of one of those southerly changes right now. We're not getting the heavy rain, but we certainly, as we've recorded this video at the beginning of August, quite a cold start to the month, a cold start to this 3-month period here. A little bit of snow, a little bit of hail, cold southerlies, maybe the odd heavier shower, but that's not going to be the flavor of the next 3 months. That's just sort of an outlier, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, as you say that, I'm standing here in Greta Point in Wellington, outside my office window. We're inside one of those heavy showers. It is pretty cold for Wellington. It's very windy. I've got my Icelandic sweater on. And yeah, it does feel like often when we do these videos, we have something right at the start of each month, which is uncharacteristic for the entire 3-month period. So we always feel like we're trying to explain away this weather system that's kind of going against the grain. And that's what we have right now, because if anyone's watching this on the 4th or 5th of August, they're going to be thinking, wow, it's cold out, and it genuinely is cold. It's probably going to be the coldest spell of the year for a lot of places across the whole country. And then you look at this and you see a whole lot of red warm colors, and you'll think, what's up with that? But that is because this cold snap early in August is not expected to be the kind of dominant pattern that we'll see for the entire 3-month period. We've got a lot of warm seas surrounding us. Over the long run, those will influence us to have a milder tinge. And also, as we go deeper into spring, especially later this month, I would say, and into September, we're already seeing hints of some good westerlies and northwesterlies setting up, bringing over some warm air from the Tasman. And in eastern areas, we could see some spiky temperatures with those setups. We start to get more sunshine, obviously, in spring, and it really can ramp up those warm northwesterlies, the föhn wind in some eastern locations.
That's good to know. And before we move on, because I want to talk about how we got here and sort of update to, the sea surface temperatures and some of the other elements that we look into to make these forecasts. Before we get to that, with all that we've just said in the last couple of minutes, you beautifully explain why we expect drier than normal conditions in most north and eastern areas, and why the temperatures are going to be warm and potentially spiky at times, with the caveat that there still will be cold spells, there still will be wet spells. But your overall plan for those who are in water-sensitive industries, or for those who have interest in water, what should you expect as far as impacts for anybody watching and curious about how this is going to impact them?
Yeah, well, we've already started to see the country shift generally to slightly drier over the last 3 months. When you sort of look down the line, you see generally more dry than there has been wet over the last 3 months, which for some people might be hard to believe, because we've had, at least 2, maybe 3 really significant rain events. But actually over that period, it's averaged out to an awful lot of dry, an incredibly dry May, for example.
Sure.
Going forwards, the general trend for an awful lot of the country is that we'll continue with a sort of long-term rainfall deficit as the most likely outcome. And as we go deeper into spring, what happens is we tend to see more wind, stronger sun, higher temperatures. What that means is that there's more factors in play to dry things out even further in those conditions. So we're seeing less rain falling for most areas, with the exceptions mentioned earlier, and also more potential for things to dry out. So, we're thinking about fire risk as one potential concern, soils drying out, which will be a concern for people growing in various places around the country.
Right. Yeah, and ag is so important to this country. I mean, it's such an incredible part of not just our society and history, but the economy, and so many people are impacted it. So I guess it's the time to plan right now. It's not a cause for an alarm, but it is a heads up. We've been talking about this for months, this El Nino, and how this would likely be the impact, and we're starting to see signs of that already.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that's really good to bear in mind is that a lot of these places that we're looking at that have the normal or below normal, or the below uh, normal rainfall category here, those are areas that last year, especially in the summer, we
Mm,
had above normal rainfall. We had things like systems dropping down from the
mm,
north in
mm-hmm.
January was a great example where Bay of Plenty and Northern got hit by pretty significant rainfall events, ended up coming in very wet. This is a flip to a different kind of regime for them.
And I think that's something we'll touch on in just a couple of minutes. The change from the overall climate drivers from earlier in this year and late last year to where we are now, that flip from La Nina to El Nino, and
Yeah.
it's an incredible change. So it's a good transition. Let's talk about where we are now and where we were. And I've rolled back this particular map, the sea surface temperature anomaly. So this shows you, of course, the difference from what is normal for sea surface temperatures, and the reds would be the warm, and the blues the colder area. And I was able to show this last month, and I think, let's see if I can click it on again. There's that region that we watched, that Nino 3.4 region, John, and walk us through what's happening from where we were, January, February, March, to where we are now, and how that's all played into this forecast.
So this is the tail end of the La Nina event where you're starting in March. That
Mm.
means colder than normal waters in the central Pacific, shown by the blue colors. And if we play it forwards, what we'll see is those colder than normal colors pretty quickly dissipate into nothing, and then equally quickly ramp up into warmer than normal. All these reds and orange colors developing really fast as we went into late autumn and into winter. And as we come to the end here, you can see that we've got warmer than normal waters all the way extending from South America into the Central Pacific. This is already looking like a good characteristic El Nino event.
Hmm.
And that is a huge flip in what I believe we had there was 5 months. As we'll see on some other things coming up soon,
Yes.
that is abnormal.
Yeah, it's a big change.
Yeah.
We went from La Nina, weak to moderate, and now we're borderline on a pretty strong El Nino. We saw those temperatures change. So what happened? Like, what, briefly, how does the wind and all this change make this all come about?
So what we had been watching all year was that even though the waters in the surface of the Pacific were colder than normal at the start of the year because
Right.
it was a La Nina, we could see underneath the surface developing warm water coming underneath it and extending eastwards. And we knew that that is the
Mm.
potential precursor of an El Nino event. And then we started to see it upwell and arrive in the Eastern Pacific. That was where it first started to make its cause known. And eventually we started to see the atmosphere show some characteristics as well. It really starts to change the wind pattern across the Pacific Ocean. And then what happens is, as we get deeper into El Nino events, the atmosphere and the ocean start to act as a sort of feedback mechanism. They both reinforce each other. So there's two components of it,
Mm.
which we'll get to in a little bit later. And we're sort of into that phase now where the two are helping each other along.
Right. So we've seen the winds change. We've seen the circulations change. We've seen the movement of the ocean water at depth, and the temperature changes there. There's a lot more. We don't have time to explain the whole kit and caboodle, but we can talk about that. If you want to see that, there are previous videos where we've touched on that, but also on the NIWA website. If you just do a search engine, Google search for NIWA El Nino, NIWA El Nino, or Earth Sciences New Zealand El Nino, you can find some information on that. So just a little plug for our viewers who may be watching. So with that said, we're going to move on to, we're going to talk about one of those elements we look at, that index, in those indices we look at, that relative Nino index. One of the more important ones. We've got this graph here. Walk us through what we saw, where we were, and where we are now, and what the forecast is, John, and why, part of the reason why we know that El Nino is not just here, but it is expected to be quite strong.
Well, that would be it'd be a whole day long lecture series we could go into. There's so much to talk about,
Yeah,
but we can make it snappy.
there you go.
Um, there, so we discussed just before that El Nino is in the atmosphere and it's in the ocean. What we're
Mm,
looking at here is the ocean aspect of it. We're basically looking at the sea surface temperature in the Central Pacific.
hmm
And what we're looking at here is temperature is on the axis on the left and time is on the axis on the right. So time is going forwards in time to the right. And what you can see is a whole bunch of lines, which are forecasts going upwards as we go forwards in time. The main one to look at is the black line, which is the average of a whole bunch of models. Probably it's the single most important of those lines. It
mm.
averages out all the sort of idiosyncrasies of each model. And you can see it's got an upwards trend. And it's just starting to level out as we sort of get into November, December time. So that's roughly when we think the peak could be approached. And that's still some time away. So things are still heading upwards, even though, as we saw in the previous image, we clearly have El Nino conditions in the ocean already.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to see that. Boy, okay. So how about this? We were down here in this blue area in January, John, and now we went from that blue area, which would be indicative of La Nina, to well above the threshold of El Nino in a few short months. And you say the peak is still yet to come. So what do we expect? Like, how does that impact New Zealand and our part of the world going forward as we get closer and closer to that peak?
Well, we're heading towards values which on the left are basically the intensity of the event
Mm.
is judged by the values on the left, which is the actual sea surface temperature anomaly. You can see things are starting to line up at the value of 3 degrees,
That's crazy.
which I know it genuinely is crazy, and I think people may not realize how crazy it is
Mm.
because they think that 3 degrees to us land dwellers doesn't sound like much of a
That's nothing.
change,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Three
It's
degrees.
nothing,
We do that in a few
Yeah.
hours.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday afternoon, Christchurch, I think, dropped almost 10 degrees in an hour.
Yeah, no big
What's
deal.
what's 3 degrees between friends? Um, but the fact is that water is much harder to change the temperature of.
Mm.
It takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water, and especially when we're talking about, deep oceans. Now we're looking at the surface here, but it takes a lot of energy to change the water temperature by 3 degrees, and we know that is dramatic. It is
Mm.
significant, even though it doesn't sound like a big number to a lot of people. It really is significant, and so we're heading towards what will ultimately end up being classified as a very strong El Nino. We
Hmm.
think could potentially be one of the strongest ever or the strongest ever. It's on the cards. And that means that these impacts on New Zealand, which are always somewhat lagged anyway, um, are still way down the line for us. So it's basically an event that's going to be around for a long time. It's going to be an intense event while it's around. And that means that we've got a long period of time during which this is going to be a major driver for us.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the relative Nino index. Let's talk a little bit about the surface pressure and why this is important. Explain this map to us here, that pressure difference between Darwin and Tahiti. Why is this important? Why do we look at this, John?
Yeah, it seems pretty esoteric, doesn't it?
Mm,
But uh, basically, what we have here is we've got our classic blue colors are lower than normal pressure, and red colors are higher than normal pressure.
sure.
Now, Darwin and Tahiti, why on earth are they highlighted on there? This is because it's the Sudden Oscillation Index, which is pretty much the oldest sort of formal measure of El Nino. Now we're into the atmospheric component of measuring El Nino, which is in the old days, they were able to measure the pressure at Tahiti and the pressure at Darwin and subtract those two anomalies from each other. And what we would end up with is a measure of basically the pressure gradient across that part of the Pacific.
Hmm.
And that gets massively disrupted in both La Nina and El Nino events. Well, in La Nina events, it's kind of like normal but stronger, but El Nino is like a complete disruption and reversal of it. And so these negative values are basically the El Nino signature in the atmosphere, a complete disruption to the normal pressure anomalies that exist in the tropical Pacific. And the key thing here is that if you just look back into as recently as March, those values were up into positive La Nina values. And then basically within 2 or 3 months, it was into El Nino territory. And now, just recently, hot off the press, we know that the sudden oscillation values for July were the strongest El Nino negative values on record for the month of July, which is pretty, it's pretty crazy. Not only is it really almost unheard of to go from a La Nina to an El Nino so quickly, but we've also managed to go to an incredibly extreme one so quickly.
Yeah, the flip has been it's madness in a sense.
Yeah.
No hype intended. Like it is.
No.
It is something that has not been recorded in our, certainly not in our lifetime, but not since these records began in the 1800s, right?
That's right. Yeah, we had to delve through the historical records, and yeah, for July, there's nothing quite like this on the record, which is just starting to show that this El Nino event wasn't just forecasting model hype. It's actually starting to become significant in reality in the measurements as well. So we're at a very interesting stage where not only do the forecasts continue to look really astonishing, but even the observations are looking really astonishing. So it's kind of like for a meteorologist, you could say what a time to be alive. You won't see this very often.
Right. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, we don't know for sure how El Niños and La Niñas will respond to a warming climate. We have some ideas, but it's possible that we may never see this again in our lifetime, our kids' lifetime, or maybe this could be the new normal.
Yeah, well, this is the interesting thing, is that this thing we're seeing here, where we're going from rapid flips to intense events, there is some science out there that suggests that that's the future trajectory of the El Nino sudden oscillation, that La Nina and El Nino events will flip between each other more rapidly and be more extreme as they do so.
That's incredible to think about, and I don't mean that in a positive way, more of like just how unusual it is for us to be living in this time and seeing these changes in the atmosphere. And I want to get to this map very quickly before we wrap things up. You mentioned the change. So one of our climate scientists, Nico, has done, he's compared this developing El Nino to some of the big ones. And this map, I think, or this image sort of really tells a story, John. So quickly, can you break down what has changed since January to where we are now, and why is 2026 such an outlier at this point?
Yeah, so we're back into the ocean again. We're looking at our RONI value, which is sea surface temperature in the Central Pacific.
Right.
The red line is this year, and I think that the best thing to do is compare it with 1997, which is kind of like the poster child of El Nino events.
One of the biggest.
Green line, yeah, it's a legendary event. And you can see where we are now, which is July, August. We're level pegging with that green and red line. Basically, we're on track with 1997, wow. But we're way more impressive than 1997 because we started from much lower.
Yeah.
So our development of El Nino, I think it's fair to say, is more impressive than 1997, and 1997 was an impressive event in itself.
At this point, you just have to wonder, and I mean, of course, I value, and I think a lot of our viewers will value your opinion on this. Of course, you're going to back it up with some science, but does a strong El Nino, potentially one of the strongest on record, necessarily mean strong impacts for us?
I think it makes certain impacts more likely, and I
Mm,
think that certain organizations are quite good at communicating that.
mm,
You can see from NOAA when they put out things, they make that very clear. Now, New Zealand is in a part of the world where we have various other drivers affecting us. You can see one of those happening right now. Short-term drivers are affecting us.
mm,
In the middle of August, short-term drivers are affecting us again, and we start to see some potential rain events that are, again, uncharacteristic of what we're expecting going
mm-hmm,
forwards.
mm-hmm.
But as we get deeper and deeper into this event, we've got this one huge driver in the tropics that's really going to be very hard to prevent it from affecting us significantly. So other factors will get in edgeways on us from time to time, but just the sheer strength of this event means that I think it's going to be a pretty persistent, dominant driver on us.
As we wrap up, well, I mean, we can talk at length and just keep going, but we want to keep the video somewhat shorter and people to be able to take a break and grab a glass of water and kind of digest the information. As we wrap up, John, is there anything you want to leave the listeners and viewers with before we kind of wrap things up? Is there any other final thoughts here as we have wrap this update up here at the beginning of August?
Yeah, I would just say if you're watching this early in August, don't expect that what's happening right now is what's going to dominate the whole 3-month period.
Right.
And if you're in a place that is pretty prone to problems in westerly winds, keep an eye out for those later as we go into the outlook period, especially into spring. Spring is already a pretty windy,
Mm-hmm.
westerly sort of dynamic period for us, and I think that we should expect that to be the case this year, and most likely even more so.
Yeah, not necessarily the news you want to hear if you live in a place like Wellington or
Exactly.
some of these
Yeah,
windier places, Marlborough.
yeah, yeah. Spring is already very windy for Wellington, and
Yeah.
these indications would suggest that we're not really going to cop much of a break from it.
Yeah, I think and in addition to that, energy industry, the water industry, the ag sector, everyday Kiwis as well are going to be very interested to see how this is going to play out. And I think we've given people a good idea of how this will evolve, but there's still a lot of factors at play. So we'll have another update in another month, John, and I'm looking forward to seeing how El Nino continues to develop, how the forecast plays out, and really appreciate your insight today.
Yeah, no problem. Looking forward to seeing you next time, and hopefully it will not be as cold.
Yeah, I suspect there will be a new spanner in the works as we update things at the beginning of September. All right, with that said, we'll wrap things up. Thanks a lot, John Tunster. Appreciate it.